Again, thank you for being here, everyone, today on this Saturday morning. And those of you who are watching the future, thank you for catching up with this recording on policies today. I'm Dan Alexander, Nichols Consultant, and I'll be your host today. We are joined today by our presenter. It's retired Emporia Public Library Director, Robin Newell. Robin Newell's library career spanned 24 years in Georgia, Nebraska, and Kansas. She served as the president of the Nebraska, Kansas, and Mountain Plains Library Association and attended and mentored at both the Nebraska Library Leadership Institute and the Mountain Plains Library Leadership Institute, and is an alumni of the First American Library Leadership Institute in 2013. That's a lot of leadership. So I will kick it away to you, Robin. Thank you.
There we go.
Sorry, I had to mute everybody. My bad.
That's all right. Good morning, everyone. I am Robin Newell, and I'm really happy to be with you here this morning. I want to say also a word of thanks to everybody that's here, because you have all committed your time and your skill set to helping libraries in Kansas, and that is such an important thing right now in the climate that we're living in. So I want to say thank you to that commitment that you've made. I also want to say thank you to any staff members that are watching. You guys rock, and just keep up all the good work. Thank you to Nichols for allowing me to come and talk to you about library policy development and management. You know, this could be a very boring, long hour and a half. So I'm going to try to insert some humor a little bit in. So just bear with. And this thing will be recorded, so you can go back and look and take notes or whatever. But we're going to get started this morning. And we're not doing anything. Hold on. There we go. So I've got 14 years of library director experience, but I was lucky enough to come up in library land. That means I started at the very bottom of that totem pole on that staff roster. And I think that has helped me in many ways understand how important policies are to libraries. Having worked on every level and having had that policy to look at and fall back on, whether it was an outward facing, inward facing, or self-facing. Dan's already kind of gone over the housekeeping issues today. I'm going to try to break this into about 4 segments, about 20 minutes or so. It'll depend on how long I talk and where we're at. But I am going to try to break it up a little bit so that you can have about a 5-minute break in between those 20-minute segments. I encourage questions. Anonymous questions are great. Questions in chat are wonderful. And we'll have some time at the end that Dan is going to unmute so that you can ask more questions in person if you want to. Now, I will tell you that as far as the questions, you see my little rabbit on the screen. That's my rabbit hole, because I am known to go down rabbit holes when I'm answering questions, and one topic will spin off of another topic. But today I'm really going to focus on not going down the rabbit holes, focus on policy, and focus on board responsibilities for development and management of those policies. So this is what you can expect today. We're going to talk about, why do we write policies in the first place? What's the purpose for policies? Who cares? And then we're going to talk about how to develop a policy, what that step-by-step structure looks like. Then we're going to talk about the management of those policies. Now, most libraries will have 20 to 30 policies, depending on how large you are. I would imagine, again, having seen Topeka's and Lawrence's, their policy manuals are much larger. You might have a service manual, and you might have a personnel policy manual. You can break this down in many different ways. So, and then we'll talk about the implementation of policies, because that's what they're for. Policies are not to set in a book somewhere. They are to be implemented. We'll talk about challenges, which again, in today's culture and climate, that seems to be a very popular popular thing, talking to library directors and other board members. And at the end, I'll do a little short summary, and then we'll have time for questions and a little short time for discussion of those questions. So this is why you're here today. I love this picture. You're here today to be informed about your role in developing policies, to be educated in what those policies should address or could address. And then the last thing, you are here to protect, to learn to protect that library. Not only to protect that library, but to protect yourself as a board member, to protect the staff of your library with a great personnel policy. So those are your 3 issues. If somebody said to you next week's like, why did you go to that training? You went to that training to be informed. You went to that training to be educated about policy. And you went to that training because you care about your library and yourself, and you want to protect the library, yourself, and your community. So this is why libraries require policies. Now, there's all kinds of different policies. The collection development policy is one that you'll hear probably the most about a lot of times, because that seems to be the hot one when challenges happen, are the collection development policy. This is the policy that tells you why you buy the books that you do, how they're selected, why they're selected, and it is, that's where your document lives as far as any type of removal of books. That's where your form lives, is within that collection development policy. It's usually an addendum or an attachment to that collection development policy you request for reconsideration. Another strong library policy that I have used a lot is your code of conduct policy. In earlier presentations of this type of subject, I actually had unacceptable behavior there. And I took that out and made it code of conduct because I really wanted to be more positive. So this is the library operation rules, I guess. You know, you can't sleep in the library. You can't leave the restroom a mess. You can't smoke in the library. And it gives staff, especially, really something to go by when they run into situations that they have to deal with out on the floor. Another one is your finance policy. Should have a strong finance policy. That's part about being a good steward to the tax money and to the gift money that you receive. And then the last one is one that sometimes gets overlooked in some cases, and that's the personnel policy. You really want to have a strong personnel policy because it's supportive of your staff. It protects you as a board. You would need to have policy for grievances. If you have a personnel person that is upset, you would need to have a policy for grievances in there. Many other that we'll touch on a little bit later in this presentation. One that was added probably in the last 10 years was diversity, equity, and inclusion. Should have a policy on this, as far as it used to just be kind of the back in the day equal opportunity, and that has grown into a policy on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It does not say equality there, it says equity. Those 2 words are very different, but this is a policy that most libraries should have, in all libraries actually should have in effect, as something to fall back on if there are questions raised as far as why you have things going on in your library or why you are supporting different groups. Then you have the legal requirements. There are legal requirements for policies in libraries. One of them is the COMA, which is the Kansas Open Meeting Act. And that says, it's basically a sunshine law that says the board can't do anything in private. They can't meet in private. A quorum cannot meet in private to discuss anything. So you'll need to have a policy on your board meetings and when those happen and how many is a quorum and that type of thing. And then you'll also need to have a CORA policy, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. That's the Kansas Open Record Act. And we'll talk about that when we get to policies. So policies are fluid, ongoing processes. It's a document that is you start out with, and a policy may be years and years old. I have started out with policies in, I would say, 2016 that were written in 1999. The terminology changes, the focus changes. So I think of policies as this is what the policy is. It must stay this way forever and a day, is not necessarily true. A policy can be a fluid document. It's an ongoing process depending on where your community is at, where your staff is at. And that's where we get to the development input, the development process with a director, starting with that process, and then the library staff, board, and community. All four of those entities are included in development of policies. Now, your board may have a library policy committee. And if you don't have a library policy committee, I would highly suggest you think about having a library policy committee. If you don't have enough people to have a library board policy committee, you might want to have a policy wrangler. And that's where the cowboy picture came from, because sometimes that's what you feel like you're doing with the policies. You're out there looking for them. Sometimes they're lost policies. You got to rope those policies in and bring them in. And then you're going to have to brand them with your own community standards. So if you don't have a library board policy committee, then have a policy wrangler, one person on that board who is in charge of making sure that whatever policy you're reviewing is going through the process and it doesn't get hung up. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, and I'm not going to read this screen to you because you can see by the kitty cat picture that it just makes me go cross-eyed. I remember the first time when I came from Nebraska to read the Kansas statute on the powers and duties of the library board. It just made me go cross-eyed. It was just like, wow, this is a lot. And to expect a volunteer person to come forward out of the community and read all of this, take all of this in, and be responsible for this was just a lot to do. So that said, here's my quick and dirty translation for you this morning. The photo is a photo of a bust of Athena, who in Greek religion was the city protectress. And that's kind of the way I think about the board, is the library protector. They are identified by their urban and civilized, and they really want the community to grow and be great. So here's your quick and dirty translation of that statute. So the board's going to adopt policy. They're going to have a building. They're going to make sure that that has a collection. They're going to hire a librarian. They're going to establish and maintain library services. They're going to contract with other entities for library service. And you'll see that in many of the counties with a larger library, they'll contract with the smaller libraries to provide library services for those. Sometimes district libraries do that. The board is going to review, accept, and administer any money. And that's government money, that's private money, whatever money comes in, you are going to accept that and make sure that it is spent in the way that it's supposed to be spent, which means you do the budget, you pay the bills. You're going to make an annual report to the state librarian. Now, honestly, it's the board's duty under state statute, but it actually falls to the library director in Kansas to submit that annual report by January 31st, I think is what it is. I don't really remember anymore. And to the city. So 2 places it goes. It goes to the state librarian, because in Kansas, the annual report that you approve is how you get your grant money. And I believe it may also be a NECLS requirement in order to get money. And then the last thing is to place the money received from sources other than a tax levy in a separate fund. So that's the quick and dirty translation. Again, go back, and when you have nothing else to do in your life, and read those statutes. I always ask my boards when I do my orientation, my new board members, I said, read it once. And then if you have questions, we had to answer those questions. But again, this is state law. This is a state statute. It's above policy, so you should know what you're committing to. And if you can't deal with the quick and dirty translation, this is my 5-finger library board description. You got to hire a librarian, because most people already have a building. You have to approve the policy. You have to approve the budget and pay the bills. You have to advocate for the library, and you have to approve the strategic plan. Now, that's my elevator speech for you as a board member. If you're a new board member, it's easy to remember. Just put them on your fingers. The first 3 are directly out of the statutes. The last 2 aren't in the statutes, but I really think that they are paramount to what you'll be doing as writing policy, and that is advocating for the library and approving a strategic plan that, of course, your policies would support. So we are actually, let's see here. So this is the answer to the question, whose job is it anyway? So we've gone through this whole policy overview about you as a board member and what it is that you do, what you are charged with by state statute. So whose job is it to write policy anyway? Well, this is a story about everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done, maybe writing policy. Everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have. Now, it's a cute little story. I will tell you that I have seen this play out in boards, in staff, in library land. In fact, it plays out in life in general, wherever you're a service person, if you're in Rotary or Lions or wherever, but it's just like, whose job is it anyway? And I will tell you right now, that finger's pointing at you. It is your job to write the policy. You are accountable for that policy. That makes you the governing body of the library. So we are at our first 20-minute stopping point. So we will stop for about 5 minutes and we'll be back in 5. Dan?
Excellent. Thank you, Robin. Appreciate it. Appreciate you building a little break for us. Yeah, feel free to stretch your legs if you need to. We'll be back here in just about just over 4 minutes. Thanks. Feel free to put any questions you have too. Before we get started again, I did wanted to recognize that we had a couple of other NECLS employee staff members, actually consultants, my colleagues. Jessie Harris, who I like to consider our librarian. She manages our professional collection and also helps with ILL and database training. So thank you, Jesse, for being here today. She's a great resource for getting more information. Robin Hastings, who some of you may already be familiar, is also here today. She works heavily along with Michael McDonald with trustees. She's full of answers on that and also programs and services. She manages a lot of our digital services, things like Flipster, which is for digital magazines. We also deal with some other digital services that she keeps the numbers on and keeps us going on that, also with our catalog. So, Robin, I think we're probably good to go ahead and bring this back together. Thank you.
All right, now we're going to talk a little about library policy. This is going to get us a little further down into the weeds. We're going to talk about development, but library policy is the guide. It's the Bible. It's the whatever you want to call it to the operations and management of the library. You got to have it. It maintains the standards for the staff and it avoids inconsistency. So if you have a policy that says, for instance, you have to have a library card to check out. You can't say, I forgot it at home. You can't say, it's in the car. You have to have a physical library card to check out. That may seem odd, but I see libraries, especially in the smaller communities where you know everybody and everybody knows you and your business. But if you're in a larger community, you may or may not know that individual who's standing there in front of you. So that is a requirement in many libraries. But it avoids those inconsistencies in service. And I have seen this before where Joe came to the circ desk, said, I don't have my card. And they say, okay, George, not a big deal, Joe, not a big deal. I know who you are. I'll just look you up. And then the next person comes up, the circ staff person has no idea who that is. And the guy says his name. And the circ staff person says, I'm sorry, Bill, I don't know you. You'll need to have your library card. And that's an inconsistency in service level, where if you know the person that you're checking out to, why are you treating them more differently than a person that you don't know? And I know in your mind, in a circ staff mind, it can be okay, but that's why it's important to have those policies written to maintain those standards. The policy also measures the extent to how a library performs and functions and meets their objectives. As I said earlier, that strategic plan, policies are extremely important to support that strategic plan, whatever your service levels are in that strategic plan, as well as its systems and its services with the staff. So library policy, the point here, it's extremely important to the health, well-being, and longevity of your library. So let's play a game. Most of you might know Two Truths and a Lie. It's used a lot of time in parties. Some people hate it. But this morning, I'm going to tell you 2 truths and a lie. And in your chat box, I would like you to post which number you think is the lie. So, and then Dan, we're going to take about a minute and let people think about it and post. But after a minute, we're going to look at those numbers and see which one they think is a lie. So here's the first one. Got it?
Yeah.
All right. Situations change and policies must change too. 2, strong policies ensure smooth library operation. And number 3, inadequate, non-existent policies leave staff and board vulnerable. So, which one do you think is a lie? Put your number in. We'll take 1 minute from now.
We've got a lot of answers already, so we probably only need to do about half that.
All right.
We're all over it.
Good. Well, we'll talk about each one of them then.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it looks like we've, I think we have a clear choice here. I don't think I saw any variations from chat. So either they've been to a lot of parties and are familiar with this two truths and a lie game already, or that you really understand policies. So yeah, it looks like two was the favored choice here. Um, Go ahead and talk to us about these.
And so that is the lie, and the lie in that word is ensure, smooth. But number one, situations change, policies must change too, and that was, I spoke to that a little earlier. I'm glad that somebody caught that. The world changes, libraries have to change as well. So that's just part of policy development and management. Number two is the lie. Strong policies do not ensure smooth library operation. They absolutely help you, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be bumps along the road. But better to have the policies that you can fall back on than not to have the policies at all. But it doesn't, just because you wrote a policy that said X does not mean that it's going to work when X happens. So you still have to have that. You still have to have that conversation with the person. You still have to have that director that can and staff that can implement. Number three, inadequate, non-existent policies leave staff and board vulnerable. That is absolutely a yes. That is a very strong yes. So 1 and 2 are strong truths, and number 2 is a lie. So policy development. Now, use your resources. There's no need to recreate the wheel. You should expect, board members, you should expect your director to have gone out and research sample policies. They can contact your system, they can contact your other libraries, they can contact their colleagues, they can contact whoever. But there are so many policies out there right now that if you don't have a policy on X, Y, and Z, I will almost guarantee that I've only had one policy that I haven't been able to find that fits well online. But you can go out there and look for policies on other libraries, and you can find a policy that you can use as an outline for your policy. So don't make it harder. Don't overthink this. Just get it done. I mean, just get those policies in place. So you can review the positions and public policy statements approved by the Council of the American Library Association. That's a great place to start. You can look on United for Libraries. Another great place, you can look on the ALA page, and that is the American Library Association page for the policy statements. There are so many policies out there, so don't be afraid when you go back to your library and you're looking at your policies and they're forever old, or you only have 5 policies and you really need 20. Don't be afraid to get started on this, because there's plenty of people out there, and NECLS is a great resource as well to get those policies written. Once you get that first draft, and that first draft is usually prepared by the director with input from the staff, always better to get that staff input, because many of these policies the staff are going to have to implement. And I can remember when I tried to implement you have to have a library card policy, the staff said, well, they're going to be mad at me. The people at the staff that I know are going to be mad at me because I'm going to want them to have a library card. And so you really have to start these drafts out with the director and then work them through the staff if it's a staff implemented policy, and make sure that the staff understands why you're doing this. Not every staff member has been to library school and they understand the equity of service levels. So really needs to start with that staff input. Then once the current policy, if it's a current policy already, if that's one of those 5 you've got already back there, usually the director just reviews it and with staff input of anything that's changed, or like we need to have our books checked out for longer than 3 weeks or less than 3 weeks. That would be staff input. Then that policy, whether it's a first draft or a current policy, goes into the policy committee or to a policy wrangler. So I kind of think of this as like a little flow chart, and you've got the first draft coming, and then it goes into the policy committee and to the policy to the policy wrangler. And you as board members represent the community. So this is the opportunity for you to be thinking about, how is this going to affect not only my director and my staff, but how is this going to affect my community? You know, how are they going to take to absolutely having to have a library card with it? And I'm just using that as an example, but there's many other policy examples. But you need to be thinking about any questions that need to be resolved on that level before it goes to the board for approval. Now, that first draft, many times, if it's a brand new policy, it'll go through that process. It'll go to the board for that first reading, or it may even go to the policy committee, and it'll be sent back to the director. The policy committee is like, no, we're not even going to take this to the board because there's something missing, or we have questions about this. So that first draft, that discussion, really helps. It helps the director and the staff, but it also helps the board understand why there's a need for the policy. So those communications and those conversations are extremely important to be having within the organization. So then that policy, once it's revised, or once it's been reviewed by the director, then it goes on the board agenda for a first reading. And I always like to say first reading because it gives the board as a whole an opportunity for input and the ability to send it back into committee or back to the wrangler with their questions. So it goes to the board agenda for the first reading, and then hopefully approval. So the other part of policy development is policies are public documents. There is this seems silly, but they are public documents. They should look like public documents. They should have good grammar. There should be full sentences and punctuation, and there should be some flow to the policy. Sometimes you'll see policies that are obviously they've taken a chunk of policy from Wisconsin Public Library and taken a chunk of policies from another library and put those in one policy document. I've seen that several times. So just if you are cut and copying, just make sure that you're not being redundant in the document. Each policy document, each public policy document should have a heading. It should have the name of the library. It should have the name of the policy. It should have approval date, and that hopefully is a board date, because when you are looking at those documents in 3 years down the road, you want to make sure that approval date is an actual board date, just so that you have that record in those minutes in case you need to go back and look to see when that policy was approved. You want to make sure that the board date and the approval date are the same dates. You want to use page numbers, and you want to use consistent text, font, and formatting. So if you're starting out using one Times New Roman, they should all be Times New Roman. Again, this may seem silly, but I've had several board members, many of which really want the consistency of the public document. Because they are pulled out by the public and they are looked at. So again, make that document itself consistent with the other policy documents that you have. So let's talk a little bit about the outward public facing. Now that's a lot of text on that screen, and I'm going to tell you right now that we're not going to go into these in depth, but I do want to touch on them because I think it's important, especially if you're a new board member, that you understand that these are the policies that NECLS requires for their accreditation. took those directly from their accreditation application. We're going to talk about outward facing, which is the public facing, which is the policies that you use, your staff uses to work with the public. We are going to talk about inward facing, which it can be your personnel policies. We're going to talk about self-facing, which are board policies and or your bylaws, and we'll touch on both of those. So outward public-facing policies, that's the internet use, including your internet privacy and safety. You should absolutely have a computer use policy. Budget and finance, again, that's your job is budget and finance. You set the budget. The director does it. You approve the budget. You pay the bills every month. You should have in your policy statement or in your bylaws, it should say who signs the checks. If you have a two-person signer in the state of Kansas, it is not the treasurer. The two-person signer in Kansas is the president and the secretary, which is different in other states. But in Kansas, it is absolutely the secretary and the president. So that should be somewhere in a policy statement. Facilities policies, who can use your meeting rooms, how long can they use your meeting rooms, can people cook in the study rooms, and again, we are a public library. I'm addressing public libraries here, and have a policy that your staff can implement. And you may think that cooking in a study room is maybe odd, but I've seen it in two different public libraries. So again, it's important to have a facilities policy, outward facing. Capital improvements, what are your capital improvement policies? Where is your capital improvement money? SEPA is the Children's Internet Protection Act. Again, this is federal law, and you should have a policy because you're not only should you have a policy, but this is one of the policies that is required to be approved every, I believe it's 3 years, but I'm not really, I think pretty sure it's 3 years for your public library report that you do annually. It actually has a check mark on it, has the board reviewed their SEPA policy. Confidentially a patron and library records. Again, this is one of those challenge policies. You absolutely need to have this. Most libraries do not keep records of what people have read within their computer systems anymore. I believe that there's ways for people to keep those records within their own personal accounts on the computer systems, but it's not like back in the day where they had the little piece of paper in the book, and Mary read the book, and Bill read the book, and Susie read the book, and then Jack could come into the library and look at that and say, wow, these 4 people have read the book. It must be pretty good, so I'm going to read it. Or, wow, these 4 people have read this book. I'm going to have to see about this. So again, you want to have that confidentiality policy for patron and library records. Important on that as well is computer use. What people do on the computer should not be kept in a record. When the person leaves that computer, that should be wiped from that, and that's for your protection and for the patron's protection as well. Emergency preparedness and disaster recovery. It's tornado land in Kansas. I don't have to say this. You need to have a policy for that, whether it's a fire or tornado or whatever. Where are your people going to be? Exhibits, displays, and bulletin boards. Again, this is a policy that has been very helpful in the last, I would say, 5 years, as far as exhibits with diversity, equity, and inclusion. An important policy to have and to have it up to date. Equipment use. Who can take the portable cameras out? What does that look like? Who can use the technology? Who can use the laptops? Who can use the hotspots? You should have a policy for anything equipment-wise that people are using in your library. Gifts and memorials. Oh my gosh, this is one of the first ones I learned way back in the day. You need a policy for gifts and memorial because I worked in a library in Nebraska that had a whole wall that was nothing but a person's private collection that they donated to the library with the stipulation that it would be kept in perpetuity. And it was old then, and that was in 2020, I guess. So it's 25 years later. I haven't been back to that library to see if it's still perpetuity or not, but it just sucked up a huge amount of space. So have a policy about what you want, what you can do with gifts, how the money can be spent with memorials. Do you only take designated memorials? Like, I want you to buy 60 children's books on trucks or lizards or whatever. So be very specific. It's going to help your director. It's going to help your staff. Intellectual freedom. Can't say enough about that. You guys can read that on the ALA site. It's being threatened every day in the United States. Important to have an intellectual freedom statement. ALA already has one written for you that you can reference. Patron behavior, that's our code of conduct again. Public services, this is our, how long can the books check out? What, do you have to have a library card? Do library cards cost if you lose them? Those kind of things. Safety for the public is very important. So you want to have a statement that what happens if somebody hurts themselves at the library? What does that process look like? Surplus property. Not seeing that as much as I did there for a while when we were transitioning from the machines to the higher level of technology, but I saw a period of about 5 to 10 years there where we were getting rid of a lot of equipment that was no longer needed. Video recorders, DVD recorders, cassette tape recorders, LP players, overhead projectors, opaque projectors. So a lot of that stuff, somebody would just say, well, I'll take it home. It's better to have a surplus property statement so that if anybody comes back and questions where that went, you will be able to point to that and say, here's our policy, here's the process, and that's where that surplus property went. Use of personal devices in the library. It's not just a cell phone. Do you have the ability to plug in your chargers, that type of thing? And then CORA, the Freedom of Information Officer appointment. This is an accreditation requirement that the board appoints a Freedom of Information Officer. I did not know this myself for about 5 years into working in Kansas. And I kind of found out the hard way because I had a Freedom of Information request and found out that we were supposed to have one of these officers. So make sure you have somebody on the board appointed as the Freedom of Information Officer or your director. Because you may or may not ever get a Freedom of Information request, but if you do, you'll have that already in place. So we've gone over a little bit our 20-minute break here. We're going to stop for a few minutes before we go into the other two, inward-facing and self-facing policies. So we'll see you again in about 4 or 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. See you all back here. We're just at 4 minutes, and I will give people some little bit more time to get back to their seats. Robin, I had a question while we were here. I know that sometimes with these, especially the public-facing policies, that we'll see that they're combined. So, like maybe I'll see the gifts and memorials in with a collection development policy. Do you have any preferences on that as far as like having like a master policy that covers all these things, or a preference to actually break them all out um, more specifically?
That's a good question. In my experience, I like them broken out. And I like to be able to find them easily. And if my gift and memorial, now that doesn't mean that in my collection development policies, it couldn't say gift and memorials, see gift and memorial policy. And then it is a separate policy, all of its own.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer to break that out because it is, while it is part of our collection development, I think it's nice to be able to hand that to someone. And I've done this many times when they've said, oh, well, I want to bring you all of my Nancy Drew books or whatever. And I want you to keep them in your children's section. It's nice to be able to just pull out that gift and memorial. Whereas if I pull out a 4-page collection development policy that contains that gift and memorial, the public gets lost in the weeds. So as you're developing these, you want to think about not only why you're doing that, but how those policies are going to be presented to the public.
So usability is factors
Yes.
in.
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
well, let's get started.
All right, sounds good. So it's a squirrel, and this is one of my rabbit hole problems, but squirrels also, the best policy that I have ever had that I didn't have was an animal policy. I still struggle with animal policies, but I will tell you that a couple of years again in Emporia, I am in my office and the circ person comes and says, you need to come in because the gentleman has a baby squirrel. So I go out and there is a grown man that's probably, I don't know, in his 20s with several other individuals about the same age. And he's got a baby squirrel hanging on his shirt at a study table in the library. And when I say hanging, the squirrel is literally hanging on for dear life. And I tell the gentleman, it's like, you can't have the squirrel in the library, because the whole time I'm watching this, all I can think about is that squirrel is going to like detach from that guy and run through the library, and we'll never find the squirrel. So I had to, very gently tell the person, a squirrel is not a trained service animal. You cannot have him in the library. And he got kind of upset, and people at the table got upset. And I said, even, he's just got to go. So that's one example of something that you would never think somebody would do in a public library, but why policy is so important, that you have that animal policy or whatever that policy is to back your director up. Now, we're not going to go through all of these because we've talked a lot about them already. They're on the screen, they're on your handouts. But the point that I wanted to make with you is that many of these policies that you're writing can be taken inward and outward. For instance, internet use. What do you want your staff doing with the internet at work? Do you want them playing games? Budget and finance. Again, how are your checks being written? What does that policy look like? Staff professional development, safety of staff, use of personal devices in the library. I had to ask my staff to not wear their earbuds in the library while they're shelving books, because it's a safety issue. If something should happen and they're listening to loud music, they can't hear anything, it is a safety issue. So just be thinking as you're writing those policies, not only outward public policies, but inward policies as well. This is the way I feel about a personnel policy. there's our library staff, and there's a big steam blowing in the back. Why it's so important to have those personnel policies, and not just to have a personnel policy, but to make sure that it's been checked over by a human resources person. That can be somebody at Nichols, that can be somebody statewide. I know Tiffany Henschel, I'll just mention her name. She works for Johnson County. She does a great job with libraries. She's worked in libraries before. But you want to, it could be the city personnel policy that your staff works under, but make sure you have a personnel policy. And these are the policies that I didn't see, but like Dan, I think it was Dan that was talking, alluded, it could have been Mike, I couldn't tell. These were the 4 policies I didn't see on the Nichols list that I would add. Absolutely have to have an animal policy. You know, again, people are bringing their animals everywhere. So you want to make sure, you know, are you going to allow emotional support animals in the library? Are you going to allow cats, dogs, you know, lizards? I have a friend who has a parrot that he carries on his shoulder to the restaurants. So unattended child policy, didn't see that one. A weapons policy, and then social media, of course. So those are policies. Just because you have that list in front of you, don't be afraid to add policies if it's necessary in your community, is the point that I want to make with them more. Self-facing, these are your board bylaws and your board policies. Your bylaws need to be reviewed at least every 3 years, and they need to be dated that they've been reviewed every 3 years. I was looking at our board policy in a library that I was working at, and there was no date on it anywhere, and I had no idea when it had been checked the last time. So make sure that you get a date on there, and again, make sure it's a board meeting date. Your meetings, how many meetings you have, when, notice required, your attendance requirements, your officer duties, and removal of or replacement of board members. Make sure those are all in your bylaws. And again, Nichols is great. You can look at other bylaws and other libraries if you have questions. A kind of a controversial policy is a public comment policy. This falls in not only the outward facing, but also the board policies. Board meetings are not public conversations. That is a board meeting, and if you have a public person there, they are only allowed to speak during the public comment policy, or excuse me, the public comment time. So if you are going to allow people to speak at your board meetings, then make sure you have a policy that says who can talk, how it's handled, and how long they can talk. And can they talk about other things that that are not related to the library, like, you know, the time the space aliens, they were, you know, came down and visited them or whatever. And I've seen that in a library where they had a board meeting. It was a recorded board meeting, and somebody stood up and started talking about their encounter with space aliens, and they were asked to sit down because it didn't have anything to do with what was on the library agenda or a concern about the library. And then the last thing I want to add with the board is you need to be thinking about doing an annual self-evaluation of yourselves. I know you evaluate your library directors, but it's important also to have an annual self-evaluation, and that should be a statement somewhere in your records, either in the board bylaws or in the policy documents. So our policy development summary is the board's accountable. It's your job. All 3 of them are your job. And write the policies that can be understood by the public and implemented by staff. And that was the point that we were making earlier, is however you write the policy, realize that that is a public document and it's there to be used. Policy management. Changing subjects here. So we're going to go into policy management now. You want to review your current policies. What do you already have? How old are they? Do a review and think about, what do you have? What do you not have? What do you need? Your board policies should be reviewed at least every 3 years. You should have a manageable timeline that should be on a board agenda calendar. If you do not have a board agenda calendar yet, I would highly suggest you talk to your director about that. January, you do this. February, you do this. Go ahead and fill in things that you know that are going to happen. When do you evaluate your director? When do you approve the SEPA policy? Get that on a calendar and make a timeline. Do you have a policy wrangler or board subcommittee? If you have 24 policies, if your library has 24 policies, you review 8 a year. That leaves you with 4 extra meetings that you don't have to review policies. But policy management is ongoing. Put it on your calendar and get her done. Some policies need a longer review and maybe more frequently, like your personnel policy. Things change. The FMLA, the federal medical leave requirements change. You're going to need to look at your personnel policy probably every year to see if there are any changes that need to be made in there, and to make sure that you have what you need in that personnel policy to protect your library. Once you've got those policies developed and you've got them managed, you want to get them posted online. That's part of the management process. You want to post them prominently in your library if need be. Now, I'm not talking about papering a wall with policies, but your code of conduct should definitely be laminated and posted. You should have paper copies of your code of conduct available at the circulation desk for staff to use. And educate your staff and volunteers about the policies that you have. That's part of that management process. Not only does the director manage staff, but make sure that the director is educating staff and library volunteers on this is what the policy is. This is why we don't allow people to sleep in the library. This is why we don't allow people to smoke in the library. And then, of course, the implementation of the policy, which is responsible for the director and the staff. So here's your hierarchy. Again, this is like a little flow chart. The board adopts the rules and regulations for the library. They're the accountable. The board hires a library administrator. Library administrator hires and manages the library staff. And then the library administrator and library staff implement policies through procedures. Now, you notice that doesn't say that the library board implements policies, operating policies. That is the director's responsibility. So make sure that you don't get your role as a library board confused with the library director implementing those policies. Okay, right policies again. Inform, educate, and protect. You are again protecting yourselves, your library, and your community. And you're protecting them against challenges. There are more and more challenges, it seems like every day. I was talking with somebody about, it seems like the pendulum is continuing to swing. You need to have a policy for policy challenges, not just book or program challenges, but policy challenges. It's not, I would say as a library director, I would probably get 3 book challenges a year, program challenges, maybe 1 a year, depending on what was going on in the community. But you need to have a policy for policy challenges. How, if somebody is challenging your meeting room policy or your exhibit policy, how is that going to happen? What does that procedure look like? How is that going to happen? And that's where the procedure needs to be defined when a challenge happens. There should be a face-to-face conversation first. So 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a staff member who knows the policy and has the authority to have that conversation. It can be a manager of a section of the library. It can be the director of the library. It can be the tech person in the library, but somebody who understands the policy, why the policy is there, and has the authority to have that conversation. 9 times out of 10, I have found that a face-to-face conversation with an individual who's challenging a policy, they really want to be heard. At the end of that conversation, or the staff person gets a written form. And this is like a request for reconsideration, or request for whatever their, again, it's not just book or program challenges anymore. So they'll need to have some type of written form. And then there needs to be a policy for how long does the director have to reply to the written form, and then how long does the board have to reply if the person is not satisfied and appeals to the board over the director's head. Then what's that time frame look like? So make sure that you're understanding that policies are meant for the smooth operation, but part of that operation is implementing them for operations, implementing them for staff, but also protecting the library against challenges. So I'm not going to read all of these, but this is directly off the American Library Association page. What are you challenging? I just wanted you to see that it's not just about books and programs anymore. It's about materials, internet-related challenges, patron privacy, hate crime, threats or harassment to staff. It can be almost anything. So be prepared is what I'm saying. Once you have a challenge, you should be reporting that to NECLS, to your system. Your director should be reporting it to your system. Your director should be reporting it to you. You should be contacting the Kansas Library Association, their Intellectual Freedom Committee. You should be contacting the American Library Association Intellectual Freedom Committee. Now, it may work differently in NECLS. I mean, it may be enough for a library to contact NECLS, and NECLS runs with it and contacts KLA and ALA. I'm not sure how that works within that organization, but don't just let it sit on your desk. Other individuals need to know about it. Part of the reason for that is we've seen more challenges coming from wider regions instead of it just coming from your own community. We've seen it come from out of state. So reporting those challenges and those phone calls about challenges is extremely important for staff at NECLS and KLA and ALA to be able to gauge what's going on challenge-wise in the state. Extremely important to communicate challenges to the staff as well, just to help stop the chatter. It's good to educate staff. It makes a wonderful talking point at a staff meeting to bring up a challenge and explain why the person has challenged, what the response from the library is on the challenge. And you as a board member should be aware of that in the community, because somebody's going to walk up to you and they're going to say, well, you know, I heard blah, 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 blah. So you need to be aware of challenges in the library. As I said before, there are more challenges coming from broader regions now. It used to just be in your own little taxing district or your own little community. You might have someone come forward and say, I don't like this book or this material or this program. What we're seeing now, and I'll give you an example, is I just talked with an individual in Western Kansas that had been presented with a document, a request for reconsideration that was signed by 150 people. Now, that's a lot of people in some of these smaller communities, but what was found out was that of those 150 people, less than, I would say 75% of them lived in the taxing district of this library. They had gone out and solicited other signatures for this document. So you might want to think about in your policy statement, who can challenge? your policies? Is it only a resident of the community? Little P and big P. I always make this joke about the little P in library land is public, and the big P is politics. You will see a lot of politics, not only in boards, but within the community as far as libraries. So please be aware of that. Little P, big P, the public, and the political machine that funds your library. You may receive challenges from, in my case, a city manager in another state who said to me, if you don't take that library book off the shelf, I will take it off the shelf. This is an individual who had no library training whatsoever. I think he had been a sheriff in a prior, before he became a city manager. And that just took my breath away, because this was a political move on his part. The board did not take that book off the shelf, and it stayed on the shelf. But that's that political machine, and that feeds right into community standards. As much as I talk about the political machine, there are also community standards. You board members know your community. You represent your community. If you don't feel comfortable being a board member because of community standards or whatever, that is something for you to think about. But you want to think about what you're doing to protect your collection, what you're doing to protect the library, and how you can bring equity into your community. So community standards are very important. That's one of the first flags that gets raised when somebody has a question. Well, our community standards are X, Y, and Z, and we don't want this material because of X, Y, and Z. So be aware of your community standards. I want to talk about really shortly about two situations that are really policy related. The first one is the Potawatomi-Wabaunsee situation, and many of you may be aware of that because you're already in Kansas. I found out about it when I was reading one of the National Library publications, and had to go back and look at all of the newspapers and other documents that were around. But what happened is there was a district library, which is Potawatomi-Wabaunsee, and they have several different libraries. It's a district library, and one of the libraries did not want to have LGBTQ materials in it. And the library board said yes, and the city council said no. And even though the library board had a great collection development policy, and they were gonna keep the materials, the city council decided that that they would take it up a notch. And this is where it got interesting for me on a policy development and management level, is that we were no longer talking about the policy with materials, because the city council person said, we'll just take your library lease away then, and you won't have a library at all. So here's a policy that went from a policy on collection development to all of a sudden you're going to lose your facility because of your collection. And I just found that really interesting from a challenge level, and want to make sure that the impact that you understand when you're writing these policies is you don't know where they're going to end up. So it's a great example of somebody who had a really strong commitment to intellectual freedom, diversity, equity, and inclusion on their board level, but they've got a council that's going to take their lease away. What happened is they did up the lease for another year, but it's my understanding that that could be another point of discussion when that lease comes up again. So the second one is Florida Escambia County Superintendent. Again, I'm right across the bridge from Florida here, right next to Pensacola. So what happens in Florida is just amazing to me. They have just fired the one of the largest counties in Florida's superintendent because he followed board policy, which I find just amazing. Over not removing materials from a school library. And I realize school libraries are different than public libraries, but again, just amazing to see that climate change, to see that culture change. And it makes me wonder, what's coming next. So anyway, in summary, be prepared for challenges. Development-wise, you'll need the input from the director, staff, board, and community. It's a whole together. All together now, I think, is our summer reading program theme this year in Kansas Library. So it is an all-together development process. You want to write clear, concise, enforceable, and it should actually probably say implementational policy. You want to make sure you get board approval on anything that could possibly be a policy. If it's a procedure, it's one thing, but if you're writing a policy, it needs to have board approval. Implement it, and then make it publicly available. And make sure your staff knows where those policies can be found, not just in the director's office in a 3-ring binder or whatever. Make sure that the staff has a copy out at that circ desk. Management, in summary, pretty simple. Review it regularly, modify as needed, and prepare for challenges. Those are the 3 important parts about it. So what is next? This is a diving board with water. I was looking for something a little bit clearer, but questions or what's next?
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
And I do encourage you at this time, if you have a question, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask that. You can put it in chat, and you can private me. I did have a couple of things that occurred to me that were somewhat new, or I thought maybe could use a little extra attention. You had brought up the procedure for a challenge about reporting, and I would say reaching out to Nichols first is a great idea. There is the Kansas Library Association Intellectual Freedom Committee. They've been getting together for at least a year or two, and we can put you in contact with them. And we can also point to the Office of Intellectual Freedom at ALA. I would guess that we would probably encourage you to report directly after contacting us so that you can be in direct contact with those people, especially the KLA group, because they can really be your champions. One more, group of supporters besides just the regional system, because you'll find people from across the state. Sean Bird from academic libraries. I know Lacey Griffins from Johnson County Libraries. So all these kind of people that will be in your corner and your supporters. So, but yeah, reaching out to us, which we've had schools do in our area. So we would encourage that to continue to happen, and we'll get you on track. I thought the annual self-evaluation of the boards was interesting as someone who doesn't know all the ins and outs, especially when it comes to trustees. And I wondered if you could talk any more about what that looks like for boards. What would you recommend, Robin or Mike, if you had any suggestions, or Robin or anyone else really?
I tried really hard for 3 years at the end of my Emporia career to really get one of these started. I have the document. I think it should be, it's a conversation. It's just like a director's conversation when you're evaluating the director. But again, when you come into organizations that don't evaluate people or don't evaluate staff, they don't evaluate the director. Evaluating the board is like, well, I'm not getting paid for this. Why am I being evaluated? And it's not individual evaluations like a director, but it's the board as a whole. Have you been an advocate? Have you approved a strategic plan? It's more of a wholeness evaluation than it is evaluating individual directors. Does that help?
Yeah. And one kind of as a follow-up question, I'm guessing from Kansas Open Meetings Act that would not be a reason to go into executive session. So you need to, I'm guessing, have that evaluation out in a public meeting, even though, Mike, it looks like you're unmuting yourself.
Yeah, I don't think the board could use the reasons that are set out in COMA to go into executive session to self-evaluate themselves.
Yeah, so we have to kind of keep that open, and I would guess that might open yourself up to some risk if you're being transparent about what you maybe didn't do right. So I guess some care maybe needs to be taken in that situation.
Correct.
But a good first start would be maybe there's just a one-page form that is shared with the board members, and they're just asked to do their own self-reflection on these various questions, such as the ones that Robin mentioned.
Yeah,
I'd love to actually see that document you have, Robin. This is the other Robin. We have a policies repository here at Nichols, and I think that would be a really lovely, I don't have anything like that there. And so that would be awesome if you could send that in.
I will definitely send that in. And let me ask you this, Nichols folk, if you do a board retreat, if you send a library board on a board retreat, how does that work with COMA?
Well, I know that in past trainings on COMA, I've specifically seen about how, anytime you're going to be discussing library business, and that would happen in those cases, that would need to be done in the public. And that was one thing that came up with these trustee trainings that we do, is especially as watch parties, a concern that I had is, if we are here as library and we start doing cross chat with a quorum of your board, do you need then to make that training a public session? So I think with that type of retreat, you have to take care is, if you're just kind of generalizing, you're probably fine. But then once you start getting into a group and specifically talking about how that training or that retreat affects your library, you could very well be in violation.
And a great example of going down a rabbit hole.
Right.
No clear answer, but a good thing for us to be thinking about.
Right. And I think those core and COMA issues, they are important, especially to this group of trustees. We have talked to a group that was interested in being able to provide some training on CORA and COMA. So stay tuned for that, because then we can ask those types of questions that get into the nitty gritty. It won't be from the AG's office. They are not providing that as of right now. So we will be going with another source. But yeah, we will definitely be addressing that because it is so many sticky issues. And I thought it was interesting reviewing some of that, is that in some of these situations, individual board members, not the library as an entity, but the individual board members themselves take on the burden from fines. So
yes,
as a trustee, you could be fined personally $500 if somebody finds you in violation. I think that's of the Meetings Act, I do believe. And then in CORA, which is Records Act, the actual library organization would fall into violations of there. But so for those Open Meetings Act, it is important that we follow those, because if somebody comes after you, you'll get hit. When luckily I've never seen that, and I don't know if anybody else in our region has, but it is certainly a possibility. We are running out of time. I had another question just about, I like that you talked about policy wrangler, because that was another, going down the whole Meetings Act, is if you had a committee, and some of these libraries don't have extremely large boards, it wouldn't take a very large committee to then basically become a quorum, where then you needed to discuss that publicly. So I like the idea of the wrangler, because that gets you out of that problem of getting those drafts done before you bring it to the agenda and the official meeting for review.
Correct. None of our committees could be over 3 people because a quorum for us was 5.
Mm.
So we just kept it 3.
Great. All right. Well, Robin, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure working with you, setting this up over the last year. I knew that you would bring your experience to this, a very important topic for this group. I had just a couple of plugs, and I'll let Mike, it looks like he might have something to say, but I just wanted to point you to the neckles.org website. We do have a part in the resources tab called Topics in Librarianship. And if you go to that, it's our learning management system. Although I will be sharing this link, you can find all kinds of past trustees, and then more information about policies, intellectual freedom. It's all broken down by topic. You do need a username and password. So if you're not in the system and it won't let you do a forgot password link, shoot me a message, dalexander@neckles.org. That's all available on the website too. Contact me, we'll get you set up so you can get into that. One other plug, Robin has agreed to be on our systems podcast, which we'll get to set up a recording with her. And that 3rd season will debut this fall, and then we'll release a couple podcasts every couple of weeks through the end of the year. We've already had 2 seasons. You can find us by looking on your favorite podcast platform for Unbound for Northeast Kansas Library System. We've had a lot of great guests in librarianship, and we're always looking for more. So anything else that I didn't cover, Mike, before we let our folks go?
No, I think we're good. You did mention that we're working to line up some COMA specific training. So stay tuned on that. And then Jessie Harris on our consulting team here, she has been working hard on emergency preparedness and disaster recovery. So I would think over the rest of this year and maybe into next year, we'll have some more information to share with you on that. And then just a plug for our professional collection. You log into the Next catalog and you can do searches and you can find all of the content that's in our professional collection. And there would be materials in there on library policy and emergency preparedness.
It dawned on me too to maybe plug a couple of the conferences coming up this fall. We're not in person today. We used to do these trustee trainings in person, but there are some opportunities to actually interface with other people and network, both in Wichita this fall. I believe it's September is the Association of Rural Small Libraries, which is great for a lot of the types of libraries we work with, and then the KLA, Kansas Library Association Conference, about a month or so later. So those are 2 conferences that are available for you for some network opportunities. You can go with your directors. Trustees are definitely encouraged to attend these types of conferences. And we do have continuing education grants that people be eligible for. So that's money from Neckles that can pay for lodging, it can pay for travel, it can pay for conference admission expenses. So those are all tools available to you. And we would just encourage you to reach out to us. A lot of you already do. We appreciate hearing from you. Don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call us. We've got a brand new phone system we're itching to use. So thank you all for giving your time this Saturday. One final thing, we encourage you as trustees at your board meeting to discuss these topics. Obviously, the policy review never really ends. But just final words, thank you so much for volunteering your time. We couldn't do it without you. I obviously think libraries are very important to our communities, and we'll leave it at that. Get some resources out to you in the early next week. Enjoy your rest of your day.